Elias lived in a small, cluttered workshop above the town bakery. The air always smelled faintly of yeast and sugar, a pleasant contrast to the metallic tang that clung to his clothes and skin. He wasn't just any watchmaker. He was a master of tiny gears, springs finer than hairs, and crystals polished to catch the faintest glimmer of light. But lately, the light in his own life had been dimming. Commissions were scarce, and the few coins he earned barely covered the cost of materials. His most prized possession, the one thing he would never willingly part with, was his grandfather's pocket watch. It was more than just a timepiece. It was a legacy. The case was crafted from blackened steel, etched with swirling patterns that resembled constellations. Inside, the gears, made of brass and gold, whirred with a precision that defied its age. The tick of the watch was a constant companion, a steady heartbeat in the quiet of his workshop. It reminded him of his grandfather's strong hands, calloused from years of crafting, and his gentle stories of a time when things were simpler. The watch had been passed down through generations of watchmakers, each adding their own small mark, a tiny refinement to the intricate mechanism. Elias had painstakingly cleaned and oiled it countless times, each touch a connection to his family's history. He knew every curve of every gear, every delicate spring. He could almost feel the spirit of his ancestors within its ticking heart, but now even that precious heirloom was threatened. The dwindling hope in Elias' heart mirrored the slowing tick of the watch when he forgot to wind it. He knew a decision was looming, a choice that would test the very core of his being. He just didn't know what that choice would be or how deeply it would cut. He only knew that the steady rhythm of his life, like the perfect time of his grandfather's watch, was about to be disrupted. And he feared that disruption more than anything. The disruption came in the form of frantic whispers and terrified shouts echoing through the town square. Ilara, the daughter of the wealthy merchant, Mr. Beaumont, had been kidnapped. Not by ordinary thieves, but by the Serpent and his gang of highwaymen, notorious for their ruthless attacks and shadowy disappearances into the Blackwood Forest. Mr. Beaumont, a man usually brimming with confidence and booming laughter, was now a broken figure, his face etched with despair. The town guard, a small and largely ineffective force, wrung their hands, admitting they were powerless against such hardened criminals. Fear gripped the town. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered, and the usual evening chatter was replaced by an unnerving silence. Elias, watching the commotion from his workshop window, felt a pang of sympathy for Mr. Beaumont and a surge of anger towards the Serpent and his men. He knew Ilara, a kind and gentle soul who often bought pastries from the bakery downstairs. He had even repaired a delicate silver locket for her once, marveling at the intricate floral design. The Serpent, they said, was a cruel and calculating man, his face hidden behind a mask of polished steel. He commanded his gang with an iron fist, demanding absolute obedience and tolerating no dissent. They preyed on travelers, ambushing caravans and leaving a trail of fear and destruction in their wake. A heavy feeling settled in Elias' stomach. He knew that Mr. Beaumont, despite his wealth, would be helpless against the Serpent's demands. The highwayman would ask for a ransom far beyond his means, and even if he could pay, there was no guarantee Ilara would be returned unharmed. He glanced at his grandfather's watch, the steady tick now seeming louder, more insistent. It was as if the watch itself was urging him to act, to do something, anything to help. The weight of the town's fear, Mr. Beaumont's despair, and Ilara's uncertain fate pressed down on him, crushing him beneath its weight. He knew with a chilling certainty that the choice he had been dreading had arrived. The decision was agonizing, a battle waged in the silence of his workshop. He paced back and forth, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. He considered other options, other ways to raise the ransom, but none seemed feasible. Time was running out and Ilara's life hung in the balance. Finally, with a heavy heart, he reached for the watch. He held it in his palm, the cool steel a stark contrast to the warmth of his skin. He ran his thumb over the swirling constellations, tracing the patterns he knew so well. He opened the case, watching the intricate gears whir with their timeless precision. The tick, once a comforting rhythm, now sounded like a mournful dirge. He carefully polished the crystal with a soft cloth, removing any smudges or fingerprints. He wanted it to look its best, even as he prepared to part with it. He felt a lump forming in his throat, a wave of sadness washing over him. It was like saying goodbye to a member of his family, a piece of his own soul. He wrapped the watch in a piece of velvet cloth, protecting it from scratches. He hesitated for a moment, clutching it tightly to his chest. Then, with a deep breath, he walked out of his workshop and down the stairs, the watch heavy in his pocket. The pawnbroker, a wizened old man with spectacles perched on his nose, examined the watch with a practiced eye. He peered at the gears, tested the spring, and listened intently to the tick. Elias watched, his heart pounding in his chest, as the pawnbroker slowly nodded. "A fine piece," the pawnbroker said, his voice raspy. "A very fine piece indeed." He named a price far less than the watch was worth, but Elias didn't argue. He knew he had no other choice. He took the coins, his fingers trembling, and turned to leave. As he stepped out into the street, he could have sworn he heard the tick of the watch slow, as if mourning its loss. The world suddenly seemed a little colder, a little emptier. He had pawned his past, his heritage, his connection to his family. But he hoped with all his heart that he had also bought Alara's future. The coins felt heavy in his pocket, a cold, metallic weight that offered little comfort. He knew that simply handing over the ransom was a gamble. The serpent was not a man of honor, and there was no guarantee he would release Alara even after receiving the money. Elias needed a plan, a way to ensure her safe return. He spent the next few hours gathering information. He spoke to travelers who had passed through the Blackwood Forest, carefully piecing together details about the serpent's movements and the location of his hideout. He learned that the highwaymen favored a secluded valley, hidden deep within the woods, accessible only by a narrow, winding path. Elias knew the forest well. He had spent countless hours exploring its trails and hidden glades as a boy, learning its secrets and understanding its rhythms. He knew the best paths, the safest crossings, and the hidden springs where he could replenish his water supply. He also knew that the serpent's men were not woodsmen. They were brutes, accustomed to the open road and likely unfamiliar with the subtle signs of the forest. He could use that to his advantage. He packed a small bag with essentials, a knife, a tinderbox, a waterskin, and some dried meat. He also included a few of his tools, a small hammer, a set of files, and a pair of pliers. They might prove useful, he reasoned, even if he wasn't sure how. As he prepared to leave, he paused, a flicker of doubt crossing his mind. He was a watchmaker, not a warrior. He had no experience in combat, no knowledge of weapons. What could he possibly do against a gang of hardened criminals? But then he thought of Alara, of her kindness and gentle spirit. He thought of Mr. Beaumont's despair, of the fear that gripped the town. And he knew that he couldn't stand idly by. He had to try, even if it meant risking his own life. He took a deep breath and stepped out into the night, the coins in his pocket clinking softly with each step, a constant reminder of the sacrifice he had made and the mission that lay ahead. The Blackwood Forest awaited. The Blackwood Forest was a labyrinth of shadows and secrets. Towering trees, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers, blocked out most of the moonlight, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the faint, musky odor of wild animals. Elias moved with a quiet confidence, his footsteps barely disturbing the fallen leaves. He followed the winding path, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the highwaymen. He wasn't looking for obvious clues like broken branches or discarded items. He was looking for the subtle details that others would miss. A slightly flattened patch of moss, a faint indentation in the soil, a broken twig that didn't quite match the others. His years of working with intricate mechanisms had honed his observational skills. He could spot a hairline crack in a gear, a microscopic imperfection in a crystal. Now he applied that same attention to detail to the forest, reading its subtle language like an open book. He noticed a small, almost invisible scrape on a tree trunk, likely caused by a passing wagon wheel. He found a discarded horseshoe, slightly worn and bearing the mark of a specific blacksmith in a neighboring town. He spotted a cluster of disturbed leaves, revealing the imprint of a heavy boot. These small clues, pieced together, painted a clear picture of the highwaymen's route. They had traveled in a wagon, likely carrying Alara. They were heading towards the secluded valley, the same valley that Elias had heard about from the travelers. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, the shadows darker. He could feel the presence of the highwaymen, a sense of danger that prickled his skin. He knew he was getting closer. He paused, listening intently. He could hear the faint sounds of voices in the distance, carried on the wind. He crept forward, his heart pounding in his chest, his hand gripping the knife in his pocket. The highwayman's hideout was just ahead. He could almost taste the fear, the anticipation, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. He was about to enter the serpent's lair. The valley was a scar on the face of the forest, a place where the trees seemed to shrink back in fear. A rough, makeshift camp had been carved out of the wilderness. Tents made of patched canvas and stolen blankets were scattered haphazardly around a central fire pit, the flames casting flickering shadows on the faces of the highwaymen. They were a motley crew, their clothes stained with dirt and grime, their faces hardened by years of violence and hardship. Some were sharpening their swords, their movements rough and careless. Others were gambling with dice, their voices loud and boisterous. A few were simply slumped against trees, nursing bottles of cheap liquor. Elias saw Alara tied to a tree near the edge of the camp, her face pale and drawn. She looked frightened but defiant, her eyes fixed on the ground. A burly highwayman stood guard nearby, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The serpent sat on a crude wooden throne, carved from a fallen log. His face was hidden behind a mask of polished steel, reflecting the firelight in a menacing gleam. His eyes, visible through narrow slits in the mask, were cold and calculating. He exuded an aura of power and cruelty, a sense that he was a man who enjoyed inflicting pain. He watched Elias approach, his body language suggesting boredom more than surprise. When Elias stopped a few feet away, the serpent spoke, his voice a low, rasping growl. "Well, well," he said, his words dripping with sarcasm. "What have we here? A lamb come to the slaughter." Elias swallowed, trying to control his fear. He knew that his life depended on his next words. He took a deep breath and spoke, his voice surprisingly steady. "I'm here for Alara," he said. "I have the ransom." The serpent chuckled, a chilling sound that echoed through the valley. "Do you now, and you think I'm simply going to hand her over? You must be more foolish than you look." He gestured towards Alara with a flick of his wrist. "She's worth far more than mere coins." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But I am curious, what makes you so willing to risk your life for her?" Elias met his gaze, refusing to back down. "She's a good person," he said, "and I believe everyone deserves a chance at freedom." The serpent stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable behind the mask. Then he let out another chilling laugh. "Freedom? A foolish concept, but I am willing to entertain you. Let's see what you have to offer, little watchmaker." Elias held his gaze, forcing himself to remain calm. "I'm not a fighter," he admitted, "and I don't have much money, but I have a skill. I can fix things. I can make things better." He gestured towards the highwaymen's weapons scattered around the camp. "I see your swords are chipped, your axes are dull, your tools are broken. I can repair them. I can sharpen them. I can make them stronger than before." The serpent tilted his head, intrigued. "You think we care about the condition of our weapons? We're strong enough to break them again anyway." Elias shook his head. "It's not just about strength, it's about precision, about efficiency. A well-maintained weapon is more effective, more reliable. It can mean the difference between life and death." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And I can offer you that skill in exchange for Alara's freedom." He pulled out his small hammer and a file from his bag, displaying them for the serpent to see. "I can show you. Let me examine your weapons. Let me demonstrate what I can do." The serpent remained silent for a long moment, considering the offer. He glanced at his men, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He knew that many of their weapons were in need of repair, but he had never considered that a watchmaker could be the one to fix them. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, little watchmaker," he said. "You have my attention, show me what you can do. But be warned," he added, his voice hardening, "if you try anything foolish, it will be the last thing you ever do." All right. Elias nodded, relieved. He had gotten his foot in the door. Now he just had to prove his worth. He approached a highwayman who was sharpening his sword on a crude whetstone. "May I?" he asked, holding out his hand. The highwayman hesitated, then reluctantly handed over the sword. Elias examined the blade carefully, running his fingers along the chipped edge. He could see that the metal was uneven, the blade dull and poorly maintained. He took a deep breath and began to work, his small hammer and file moving with practiced precision. The fate of Alara, and perhaps his own, rested on the skill of his hands. The first sword took hours. Elias worked with a quiet intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration. He used his small hammer to carefully reshape the chipped edge, his file to smooth out the imperfections, and his keen eye to ensure the blade was perfectly balanced. He could feel the eyes of the highwaymen on him, watching his every move, their initial skepticism slowly giving way to grudging respect. The serpent, still seated on his throne, observed Elias with a detached curiosity. He had seen blacksmiths at work before, but he had never witnessed such meticulous attention to detail. Elias wasn't just repairing the sword, he was transforming it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Elias finished the first sword. He held it out for the highwayman to inspect, the blade gleaming in the fading light. The highwayman took the sword, his eyes widening in surprise. He ran his finger along the edge, testing its sharpness. He swung it through the air, feeling its weight and balance. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, his voice filled with awe. "It's better than new." A murmur of approval rippled through the camp. The highwaymen, impressed by Elias' skill, began to bring him their own weapons and tools, eager to have them repaired. Elias worked tirelessly, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate hope. The serpent, seeing the growing enthusiasm of his men, beckoned Elias over to his throne. "I have a task for you, little watchmaker," he said. "My sword clasp is broken." "Can you fix it?" He handed Elias his sword, its hilt inlaid with intricate silver designs. Elias examined the clasp, a delicate piece of metalwork that had snapped in two. He knew that repairing it would be a challenge, but he couldn't refuse. He asked for a small forge to be built, and soon a makeshift fire was blazing, the heat radiating across the camp. Elias carefully heated the broken pieces of the clasp, his hammer and file moving with even greater precision than before. The sounds of the hammer striking the metal echoed through the valley, a constant rhythm that marked the passage of time. The air filled with the smell of burning metal and the sweat of Elias' brow. As he worked, he noticed the highwaymen watching him with a growing respect, their faces no longer filled with skepticism, but with a genuine appreciation for his craft. Perhaps, he thought, there was more to these men than met the eye. But Elias wasn't just repairing the weapons, he was subtly altering them. A slight rounding of a blade's edge, making it less likely to cause accidental cuts. A better grip on a hammer, reducing the chance of a slipped swing. A more secure handle on an axe, preventing it from flying loose during a fight. These changes were almost imperceptible, but they were there, a testament to Elias' quiet ingenuity. He wasn't trying to make the weapons less effective. He was trying to make them less dangerous, less prone to causing unnecessary harm. He was appealing to the humanity beneath the highwaymen's hardened exteriors, hoping to spark a flicker of compassion, a moment of hesitation before they resorted to violence. He noticed that one of the highwaymen had a badly designed knife, the blade prone to snapping under pressure. Instead of simply repairing it, Elias reshaped the blade, using his knowledge of metalworking to create a stronger, more durable design. He explained the changes to the highwayman, showing him how the new blade would be less likely to break and cause injury. The highwayman, initially confused, slowly began to understand. He had always thought of his knife as a tool for inflicting pain, but Elias had shown him that it could also be a tool for survival, for protecting himself and others. Elias continued to work, making these subtle alterations to each weapon and tool he repaired. He didn't preach or lecture, he simply let his actions speak for themselves. He hoped that little by little he could chip away at the highwaymen's brutality, revealing the men beneath the masks. He finished repairing the serpent's sword clasp, carefully reattaching the delicate pieces and polishing the silver until it gleamed like new. He handed the sword back to the serpent, his heart pounding in his chest. The serpent examined the clasp, his eyes narrowed behind his mask. He could see the skill and precision that Elias had put into the repair, but he also sensed something else, something more subtle. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew that Elias had done more than just fix his sword. He had somehow changed it, imbued it with a different energy. He looked at Elias, his expression unreadable. "You're a strange one, little watchmaker," he said, "but I am impressed." He paused, then added, "Perhaps there's more to you than meets the eye." He sheathed his sword, the clasp clicking securely into place. "For now, you have earned your keep. Continue your work." Elias breathed a sigh of relief. He had passed another test, but he knew that the real challenge was just beginning. Alara, still tied to the tree, had been watching Elias intently. At first, she had been filled with despair, convinced that her fate was sealed. But as she watched Elias work, as she saw the respect he was earning from the highwaymen, a flicker of hope began to ignite within her. She noticed the subtle changes he was making to the weapons, the rounding of the edges, the improved grips. She understood what he was trying to do, to make the highwaymen less dangerous, to appeal to their better natures. A silent communication began to develop between them. Elias would occasionally glance in her direction, offering a small, reassuring smile. Alara would respond with a slight nod, acknowledging his efforts. They couldn't speak to each other, but they could communicate through their eyes, through their gestures, through a shared understanding of the situation. One evening, as Elias was repairing a particularly badly damaged axe, he accidentally dropped a small piece of metal near Alara's feet. She quickly picked it up and examined it, realizing that it was a small gear from a clockwork mechanism. She recognized it as the type of gear that Elias used in his watches. She looked at Elias, her eyes questioning. He nodded slightly, confirming her suspicion. He had deliberately dropped the gear, hoping that she would find it. It was a message, a symbol of his trade, of his skill, of his determination to help her. Alara clutched the gear tightly in her hand, a tangible reminder of Elias' bravery and his commitment to her safety. She knew that he was risking his life for her, and she felt a surge of gratitude and admiration. From that moment on, their silent communication deepened. They were no longer just two strangers trapped in a dangerous situation. They were allies, united by a shared purpose. Alara began to trust Elias implicitly, believing that he would do everything in his power to save her. And Elias, in turn, drew strength from Alara's unwavering faith, knowing that he was not alone in his fight against the serpent and his highwaymen. The bond between them, forged in fear and desperation, was growing stronger with each passing day. The serpent was a man of steel and shadow, a figure shrouded in mystery and fear. He had built his reputation on cruelty and cunning, on exploiting the weak and preying on the innocent. But something was changing within him. Elias' presence, his skill, his quiet acts of kindness were slowly chipping away at the serpent's hardened exterior. He found himself watching Elias more closely, observing his every move. He saw the care and precision he put into his work, the respect he showed to the highwaymen, even the most hardened criminals. He saw the subtle changes he was making to the weapons, the alterations that made them less dangerous, less likely to cause harm. He began to question his own path, his own choices. He had always believed that strength was the only thing that mattered, that violence was the only way to survive. But Elias had shown him that there was another way, a way to use skill and ingenuity to make the world a better place. One night, as Elias was cleaning his tools, the serpent approached him, his face hidden behind his mask. "Why do you do it?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Why do you care about us? We're nothing but thieves and murderers. Elias looked up, meeting the serpent's gaze. Because everyone deserves a chance, he said. Everyone deserves a chance to be better. The serpent was silent for a long moment, considering Elias' words. He had never heard anyone speak to him like that before. He had always been surrounded by fear and hatred, by people who wanted to use him or destroy him. But Elias seemed to genuinely care about his well-being, about the well-being of his men. He turned and walked away, his mind filled with conflicting thoughts. He didn't know what to make of Elias, of his skill, of his kindness. But he knew that he had changed something within him, that he had planted a seed of doubt in his heart. He found himself staring at the mask, the polished steel reflecting his own troubled image. He wondered what it would be like to take it off, to reveal his true face to the world, but he was afraid. He was afraid of what people would see, of what they would think. He was afraid of losing the power and control that he had worked so hard to achieve. But as he looked at Elias, working tirelessly by the fire, he couldn't help but wonder if there was another way, a better way. Perhaps, he thought, it was time to forge a new path, a path that was not based on fear and violence but on skill and compassion. The seed of change had been planted, and it was beginning to sprout. Days turned into weeks. Elias continued to repair the highwaymen's weapons and tools, subtly altering them to be less dangerous, less prone to causing harm. He taught them basic metalworking techniques, showing them how to sharpen a blade, how to repair a broken axe handle, how to care for their equipment. The highwaymen, initially skeptical, began to take pride in their newfound skills. They realized that they could use their hands to create, not just destroy. They started to see themselves in a different light, not just as thieves and murderers, but as craftsmen, as artisans. One evening, as the highwaymen were gathered around the fire, Elias decided to make his move. He stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "I have an offer for you," he said, his voice clear and steady. The serpent, seated on his throne, raised an eyebrow. "An offer? What kind of offer?" Elias took a deep breath. "I can teach you more than just basic repairs," he said. "I can teach you the art of metalworking, the secrets of the forge. I can teach you how to create beautiful, functional objects from raw metal." He paused, letting his words sink in. "With these skills, you can earn an honest living. You don't have to rob and steal anymore. You can use your hands to build a better life for yourselves." The highwaymen looked at each other, their faces a mixture of surprise and disbelief. The idea of giving up their life of crime seemed almost unimaginable. They had known nothing but violence and theft for so long. The serpent remained silent, his expression unreadable behind his mask. He knew that Elias' offer was a tempting one. He had seen the change in his men, the pride they took in their newfound skills. He knew that they were tired of living in fear, of constantly looking over their shoulders. But he also knew that giving up their life of crime would be a difficult decision, a decision that would require courage and sacrifice. He wondered if they were capable of making such a change. He looked at Elias, his eyes searching. "Why would you do this?" he asked. "Why would you offer to teach us? What do you get out of it?" Elias met his gaze, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I believe everyone deserves a second chance," he said. "And I believe that you have the potential to be more than just highwaymen. You have the potential to be something great." He paused, then added, "And I want Alara to be free." A heavy silence descended upon the camp. The fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the faces of the highwaymen. All eyes were on the serpent, waiting for his decision. The tension in the air was so thick it could be cut with a knife. The serpent sat motionless on his throne, his mask concealing his expression. But Elias could sense the turmoil raging within him, the struggle between his old life and the possibility of a new one. He had come to a crossroads, a moment of truth that would determine the fate of his gang and perhaps his own soul. He thought of his past, of the hardships he had endured, of the choices he had made that had led him to this point. He had always believed that he was destined for a life of violence and crime, that there was no other path for him. But Elias had shown him that there was another way, a way to use his skills and talents for good. He had seen the pride in his men's eyes as they learned to repair their own weapons, the satisfaction they felt as they created something with their own hands. He knew that Elias' offer was a genuine one, that he truly believed in their potential for change. But he also knew that it would be a path filled with challenges and uncertainties. He wondered if he was strong enough to lead his men on such a journey. He looked at Alara, tied to the tree near the edge of the camp. He saw the hope in her eyes, the trust she placed in Elias. He knew that she deserved to be free to return to her family and her life. He looked at Elias, standing before him with his head held high, his eyes filled with sincerity. He saw the courage and compassion that radiated from him, the unwavering belief in the power of redemption. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the serpent spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "I need time," he said. "I need time to think." Elias nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need," he said. "But please don't let this opportunity pass you by." The serpent rose from his throne, his body stiff and unyielding. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The highwaymen watched him go, their faces filled with anxiety and anticipation. They knew that their future was hanging in the balance, waiting for the serpent to make his decision. The night was long and filled with uncertainty. The decision that could change everything was still to come. The serpent returned before dawn, his face still hidden behind his mask, but his posture slightly less rigid than before. He walked directly to Elias, his footsteps silent on the forest floor. "I have made my decision," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I will accept your offer." A collective gasp rippled through the camp. The highwaymen looked at each other in disbelief, their faces a mixture of hope and trepidation. "But," the serpent continued, his voice hardening, "there will be conditions." Elias nodded, expecting as much. "What are your conditions?" "First," the serpent said, "Alara is free to go. She will be escorted back to town unharmed." Elias breathed a sigh of relief. That was the most important thing. "And the second condition?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You," the serpent said, pointing at Elias, "will stay. You will teach us the art of metalworking. You will show us how to forge a new path." Elias hesitated. He had expected to return to his workshop, to his quiet life of crafting watches and clocks. The thought of staying in the forest with the highwaymen, of giving up his freedom, was daunting. But he looked at Alara, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. He looked at the highwaymen, their faces filled with hope and anticipation. He knew that he couldn't abandon them now. He took a deep breath and nodded. "I agree," he said. "I will stay." The serpent nodded in return. "Then it is settled," he said. He turned to his men. "Prepare Alara for her journey and prepare the forge. We have much to learn." A flurry of activity erupted in the camp. The highwaymen, energized by the serpent's decision, began to pack their belongings and prepare for their new life. Alara was untied from the tree and given food and water. She looked at Elias, her eyes filled with gratitude and admiration. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved me." Elias smiled, his heart filled with a mixture of joy and sadness. He was glad that Alara was safe, but he knew that his own journey was just beginning. He had traded his freedom for her safety, but he hoped that in the end he would be able to forge a new future for himself and for the highwaymen. The sun began to rise, casting a golden glow across the valley, illuminating the dawn of a new era. Alara, escorted by two of the highwaymen, walked out of the Blackwood forest as the sun climbed higher in the sky. They treated her with respect, offering her food and water, and ensuring that she was safe and comfortable during the journey. They were no longer the menacing figures she had feared. They were changed men, eager to prove that they could be trusted. As they approached the town, the highwaymen bid her farewell, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and apprehension. They knew that their future was uncertain, but they were determined to make the most of their second chance. Alara entered the town square, her appearance causing a stir among the townsfolk. They had feared the worst, believing that she was lost forever. Mr. Beaumont rushed to her side, his face filled with tears of joy. "Ilara, my darling daughter, you're safe," he exclaimed, embracing her tightly. Ilara recounted her story. Emphasizing Elias' bravery and the highwaymen's genuine desire to change. The townsfolk listened in stunned silence, their initial fear slowly giving way to cautious hope. Mr. Beaumont, deeply moved by Ilara's words, vowed to do everything in his power to help the highwaymen succeed in their new endeavor. Meanwhile, back in the Blackwood forest, Elias, initially filled with fear and trepidation, began to find purpose in his new role. He discovered a natural talent for teaching, patiently guiding the highwaymen as they learned the basics of metalworking. He marveled at their eagerness to learn, their willingness to embrace a new way of life. He set up a proper forge, using his knowledge of metalwork to design a system that was both efficient and safe. He taught the highwaymen how to work with different types of metal, how to shape and mold them into useful objects, how to create intricate designs. The highwaymen, in turn, taught Elias about survival in the forest, about tracking animals, about building shelters. They shared stories of their past, of the hardships they had endured, of the choices they had made that had led them to a life of crime. Elias listened with empathy, understanding the circumstances that had driven them to such extremes. One day, the serpent approached Elias, his face still hidden behind his mask. He held out his hand, offering Elias a small, wrapped package. "A gift," he said, his voice barely audible. Elias unwrapped the package, revealing a beautifully crafted pocket watch. The case was made of blackened steel, etched with swirling patterns that resembled constellations. Inside, the gears, made of brass and gold, whirred with a timeless precision. It was almost identical to his grandfather's watch. "I couldn't replace what you lost," the serpent said, "but I hope this will do." Elias opened the watch, listening to the steady tick of the gears. It was a comforting rhythm, a familiar sound that reminded him of his grandfather, of his family, of his past. But it was also a new sound, a symbol of his.